Hello, everyone. I am really excited to be here and talk to you about a topic that's really close to my heart that I'm very passionate about. And it's cutting through the noise, which is how do you prioritize what's important in your day and focus on that? So I thought being a product manager, let me start by first talking about the problem statement, right? What is the problem that I'm trying to solve for here? Uh, One of the great things about being a product manager is that it comes with a broad range of responsibilities. We are responsible for knowing the external landscape. We are responsible for coming up with the strategy and roadmap for our product. We are responsible for coming up with requirements, execution, go to market. Right? We are often referred to as the CEO of our product, right? That ultimately, the responsibility of whether the product fails or succeeds lives with us, right? Which is great, but there is a downside to this also, that product management is a very loosely defined role, right? Almost anything can end up being a product manager's responsibility. So it's no wonder that we are often stretched really thin because we just get pulled into so many meetings, we just get pulled into so many discussions. And that's what was happening to me. So I want to also tell you a little bit of a short story about how I came to look into this topic, why it became important to me. So last year, I went through a rather rough phase at work, a rough patch where I was working very long hours. I was spending all my time at work. So I felt like I was working really hard. But at the end of the day, if you were to ask me, Parul, what did you do today? What did you get? What did you accomplish? I would have really struggled to come up with an answer. I felt like I was running really hard, but I wasn't really getting anywhere. And so, in general, I felt very stressed, very unhappy. At the back of my mind, I knew that I wasn't really working on the right thing, that I was so close to the details that I'm missing the big picture. But even though I was aware of this, I didn't really know how to break the cycle. I didn't really know how to step back and like look at the bigger picture. So one Sunday night, I was very unhappy. I was miserable. I was like, my week hasn't started yet, and I'm already behind. And my husband observed this, and ironically, my husband is a career coach, and he focuses on making people more effective in their roles. But one of our agreements is that he doesn't coach me, because let me tell you, your spouse coaching you is a recipe for disaster. But that day it was really bad for me, and I could tell he could tell that I needed some help. So he asked me that, "Oh, have you defined your goals for the week?" And so I showed him my long to-do list. I was like, "Yeah, there you go. Those are my goals." And he was like, "No, those are not your goals. That's your to-do list. Have you defined like top two or three things you would like to get done by the end of the week that will make you feel like you're moving ahead, that you're making progress?" And I was like, oh, interesting. Yeah, that is different from a to do list. So then I sat down and I spent 10 minutes writing down three priorities for myself on a post it. And just by doing that, right, just by taking those 10 minutes to think about what do I want to get done in this week, what's important to me, and writing it down, it just instantly made me feel better. It made me feel like I was in control. It made me feel like I had an anchor for my week, right? I had a mission ahead of me, and that's what I was marching towards rather than being all over the place. So I just felt like I was in control. And after that, the week following that also turned out to be better, not just more productive, but I emotionally felt better. I felt in control. I felt more satisfied with the way I was spending my time. So after this experience, I spent a lot of time researching on, okay, how do successful people really think about their day? How do they spend their day? And I also did a few experiments. So, what I'm going to share with you today is my three-step process to cut through the noise and gain clarity. Like this process that I use to plan my day has really helped me be more effective at work and honestly just feel happier, feel more satisfied. So, I hope that if you decide to follow it, you're also able to see similar results. So, my first step is to define your priorities. Let me just move that. Is to really define your priorities and write them down. what happens to us is that we're very close to the details, right? We're often caught up in the day to day execution, and we forget to take a step back and think about what's really important to us. Uh, One way to think about this is, imagine you're writing your year end review. What are the things that you're going to be able to boast about? What is the value that you have delivered? What are the skills that you have learned and brought to the table, right? Maybe you have helped build an org, but you're not going to be talk about the number of emails you have spent or the number of meetings that you have attended. So usually our value comes from some of the key initiatives, right? Some core value that we deliver. And those should be our priorities, right? If our goal is to do well at work, if our goal is to learn something new, if our goal is to get promoted, we can usually identify two or three things that will get us there, and those should be our priorities. um, so the only way we will be able to focus on those priorities is if we are able to identify them, right? And the way we are able to identify them is if we can pause, take a step back, and think about what is my goal and what does it take for me to get there, right? So take the time to do that and define your priorities. The second step is to write them down, and this is an equally important step. Every hour we have about 2 to 3,000 different thoughts, and most of them don't really stick, right? They're passing thoughts. Unless we write it down, this is also going your priorities will become another passing thought. They're not going to stick. For me, one of the reasons why these priorities remained with me throughout the week was because I had them on a post-it and I had them in my work area. So every morning I would see, these are the priorities that I'm trying to get done. So define your priorities and write them down. I also wanted to talk a little bit about how do we usually spend our time at work and how should we actually be spending it. Some of you might be familiar with the Stephen Covey's time matrix that I am sharing on the screen. So Stephen Covey really talks about the type of activities that we spend time at work, right? There are urgent and non-urgent on the x-axis, and on the y-axis there is important and not important, right? So that gives us four combinations. The first one is important and urgent, right? This is stuff like a production issue or a leadership presentation that has a tight deadline and you have to prepare for. A customer needs support and you need to jump in and help them. Right? These are the kind of things that are important and need to be taken care of right now. And for most of us, they're easy to remember, they're easy to know what they are, right? Because not doing them have consequences. So most of us are pretty good at identifying this first quadrant and taking care of them, right? But after that, we end up spending our time in quadrants 3 and 4, which is distraction and time wasting. And I'll give you my own example. The first thing I used to do when I came to work was check my email and check my Slack messages. And most days, what would happen is I get an email where somebody is asking me some information, right? So then I would spend my time getting together that information or maybe asking some clarifying questions. So a big part of my day would be spent actually responding to the requests that I had received. I was in a very reactive mode. And it makes sense because being reactive is easy, right? The problem is very clear in front of you. You know what to do, so you go ahead and do it. But where we really should be spending our time is this quadrant, the quality time. These are things that are important, but not urgent. So, for example, let's say I realize that this one initiative that I'm working on is very critical for my career growth. So then I need to spend this time thinking about, okay, what are some of the open issues that need attention where I can help? Who can influence the outcome of this initiative, nudge it in the right direction? Do I need to reach out to them? What are some of the issues I can anticipate related to this initiative and try to address them or mitigate them in advance, right? All of that planning and thinking time, this is the hard work, right? This is really what we get paid for. That is the important and not urgent. That's the quality time that a lot of your priorities will fall into, right? This is the time that you have to make to work on your priorities. So let me just summarize the step one of the process, which is to really know where you are going, right? What are your long-term aspirations? Maybe in 5 years, where do you want to be? Maybe you want to be in a leadership position. Maybe you want to be a product manager in a new domain like AI, ML, right? Or maybe 5 years seems too far out. Where do you want to be at the end of the year? Right? Think of it from that perspective. And then what skills, what experiences do you need to get there? Once you have your long term aspirations, then you can start tying what you're doing today, this week, to bring you closer to those goals. Right? And then second part is to write them down. This is super important. If there is one thing you take away from this talk today, this is it. Take the time to define your priorities and write them down. There is a quote by an author, I don't remember the name, but he says, if you don't prioritize your life, somebody else will. And unless we do this step, that's what's happening, right? We are working on other people's priorities. And that's not a bad thing, but it's even better to have your own priorities, to define your own path. So take the time to define your priorities and write them down. The second step is to win back your calendar and your time. And as a product manager, this was my biggest challenge. Uh, I mentor a lot of young product managers, new product managers, and after they become a product manager, within months, one conversation that they have with me is, um, when do you find the time to work? I have been spending all my time in meetings. When am I expected to get things done? And this is a very common problem for product managers because we do spend a lot of time in meetings. And so once I defined my priorities, I realized that was the case with me also. And I came across this quote, which I absolutely love. It's from Ramit Sethi. He says, show me someone's calendar and their spending, and I will show you their priorities. And the reason I really love this quote is because it shows you that our actions mean more than our words. Right? So just because I defined priorities, it wasn't really enough. I had to now make time for them. But this is what my calendar looked like at the time, right? I mean, there were times when I was triple booked. There was one time on Friday when I had 4 meetings that I had to decide between. And I was like, I don't really have the time to think, let alone sit down and work on my priorities. But because I had taken the time to think through my priorities, I also knew that the cost of not doing them is high. Right? That at the end of the year, unless I get these things done, I won't really have a lot of accomplishments to show for my time at work. So then I did what a lot of people actually have recommended in the past. I started blocking my time ahead of other people, right? So I would go into my calendar and book these big chunks of time, right? 1 to 2 hours at a time on, several spots during the day. And that gave me more control over my calendar, right? Because now I could screen meetings. So let's say I blocked 4 hours on Wednesday, right? Doesn't mean I would end up getting 4 hours. Typically, I ended up getting maybe 1 to 2 hours every day to focus on my priorities. But that was a huge improvement on what I was doing earlier, right? What I was getting earlier. The second thing is I realized I couldn't really do this in half an hour slots. I really needed at least 1 hour slot so that I could sit down, settle in, go deep in what I was doing. And this was super effective. In the beginning, I was a little bit apprehensive that, oh, I would be saying no to meetings. I would be missing, I had this FOMO that I would miss something important. But nothing like that happened. A lot of meetings where we feel like we have to go, as it turns out, they go on just fine without me. Right? Sometimes I refer to them the right person. Sometimes I send them the information via email, but I don't have to be there to support that meeting for half an hour. So this is a step I would highly recommend. Take control of your calendar, book time for yourself that you're able to spend on your priorities. So, uh, even so, let's say, so I did that. I defined my priorities. I started blocking my calendar. And then I realized that when I would sit down to do the work, I felt a lot of resistance, right? Because, as I mentioned earlier, responding to an email is easy, but working on a strategy, working on problem solving is hard. It takes a lot of thinking. So my instinct was to get out of it. So, the moment I would sit down to work on my priorities, I would be like, oh, I have to message my doctor. And I would be very tempted to work on my to-do list instead. So, but I had to overcome that temptation because I really had to tell myself that no, this is my priority focus hour. I am going to work on my priorities here and not on the to do list. So, put away your phone, turn off all of your notifications, email, Slack, and really make the headspace for yourself to be able to focus, right? This is your internal discipline. This is what you have to turn off your internal distractions. The second part was to train the people around me, right? Because now I had to say no more often, and and honestly, once I did it a few times, it got a lot easier. Right, so this is something that you just have to learn to say, and it also becomes a lot easier to say no once you realize, okay, if you're not going to go to this meeting, you are working on this other thing which is also very important. So just defining your priorities would make it much easier for you to say no. The other thing I had to do was, so I would be at my desk. This was obviously before the pandemic. I would be at my desk and I would be in my focus hour, and somebody would come and start talking to me. And I used to get really annoyed. I was like, they're interrupting me. And then I realized they don't know that I am doing my focus hour. So I had to get very good at interrupting them and saying, actually, I'm in the middle of something. Can we talk later? Can we talk tomorrow? Can we talk at 4 p.m. today? And once you do that a few times, people kind of know that even though you are at your desk, doesn't mean you are available. Then they would start the conversation by saying, oh, do you have a minute? And at that point, you can say, no, not at this point, but how about 4 p.m.? So exert that discipline internally and externally so that you have the time and the headspace to work on your priorities. Otherwise, priorities written on a poster don't really mean much, right? So you have to create the time to follow through. And the third step for my process is to retrospect and celebrate. So when I first started this process, I would write down maybe 3 to 5 priorities for the week, and then about 3 priorities for every day that I was doing, right? And these daily priorities would connect to my weekly priorities. But what I would so, but I realized I wasn't really getting them done. I was getting maybe 3 out of 5 weekly priorities done, and maybe 1 out of 3 of my daily priorities done. And so I was getting very frustrated. I was like, this is supposed to make me more effective, but I'm still behind. I'm still not getting enough done. So the planner that I was using for my weekly and daily planning had a retrospective step, right? Which, so at the end of the day, before I plan tomorrow, I do a wrap up of today. So I look at my calendar, I say, okay, I wanted to do these 3 priorities, but the truth is, I only had 1 hour of focus time today, right? So I was being unrealistic in setting my goals. So when I started doing these retro, 2 things happened. Number one, I realized that, okay, I might not be getting all 3 priorities done, but I'm getting at least one of them done. Right? This is a lot better than when what I was doing when I wasn't planning. So I was making progress. It was slower than I had expected, but I was getting there. The second thing is it also made me more aware of where I needed to fine tune, right? Where I wasn't being realistic, where I was setting myself up for failure. So sometimes when I have had a few weeks where my completion rate was really poor, I would go back to setting just a single priority for every day. And that would then help me get small wins, build confidence, and then I would get to a point where I can be more ambitious in my priorities. Right? So this is like a skill. Like it's like learning a bike. Nobody expects to get on a bike, start pedaling, and be like, hey, I learned how to ride a bike. That's something you fall a few times, you learn over time. So planning is also a skill. So if you do try it, expect to fail, expect to know that for the first few times you do it, you're not going to meet all of your priorities. You're not going to be able to do them. You just have to be a little bit deliberate about how you're planning and improve over time. So I wanted to just summarize the 3 step process. Number one is define your priorities and write them down. Right? Be very conscious about what is important to you. The second thing is win back your time and your calendar so that you're able to spend time on your priorities. And the third one is retrospect and celebrate. Realize this is a process that you will master over time. So, in the beginning, do expect a few stumbles, do expect a little bit of failure. If you go in with this expectation, you're more likely to stick with it. So I wanted to close by sharing this quote with you from Annie Dillard, who is an author. She says, "How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives." And our days are hours and minutes, and a huge part of this time is spent working, right? So let's make that time count. Let's make what we do at work uh, be a part of something bigger that we have planned for ourselves, right? It's easy to go with the flow, but we're not really going to live our best lives if we go with that plan. Instead, let's take the time to define our priorities and be in control of where are we going, what do we want to work on, right? Let's build our own destiny rather than handing it over to other people. Nikki, do you want to do questions
Thank
now?
you. Yes, definitely. Thank you so much.
Yep.
That's really great advice. Gives us all a lot to think about. I'm sure people are struggling with that even now as we're at home and we're all have more time on our hands.
I know. I know.
But I do have a couple of questions from the community. What advice would you give to people who find it really difficult to say no to others? For example, I have a question here. People from upper management who constantly invite you to meetings and you have your whole schedule filled up with that. How would you handle that? For someone new, or I don't know, what would your advice be?
Yeah. So let me tell you, I used to have the same problem, and then I became a people manager, and I realized what the disconnect is. When I assume that my manager knows or my management knows everything that I'm working on, but that's not the case. Nobody is tracking as closely as you are on what you're working on. So a lot of times they don't really have the visibility, so they don't really know the trade-offs. I have been in this position actually pretty recently where I had just too much going on. So then I would tell them, if I were to say, okay, I would just let the upper management know that if you were to spend time on X, what are the trade-offs? Right? To say, okay, I can attend the meeting, but that means that this would have to move to the end of the week. Right? A lot of times we assume they know the trade-offs, but they don't. So my advice for you would be to kind of give your manager really full visibility into what are you working on, right? And maybe help them prioritize for you. So if they try to add something new to your already full plate, like I'll ask them, like, help me understand where does this fit in compared to other priorities I already have. And a lot of times, just awareness, education is enough for your management to say, oh, yeah, I didn't think about that.
Thank you. Great. Yes. Okay. I have another question, a bit more specific. How do you handle sponsors wanting you to include a ton of product features that are not in line with your backlog priority list?
It's actually a very similar answer to my previous one, right? So I am in a situation where the product that I work on is in high demand from sales team, right? And every day they would come in and say, we also want this, we also want this. And I have to bring up my roadmap and say, okay, these are the things that we are building right now, right? Which are also asked by you. So now if you want to ask X, where should this go, where should this replace? And it's actually exactly the same thing, that sometimes people make different decisions because they have different information. So what you can do from your side is education. Say, this is my roadmap, right? You agreed to it. Now if you want to change it, I am open to it. Tell me what should move. So that would be my suggestion. All I want to say, guys, is be intentional about how you live your life. Don't get, it's very easy to get caught up with the emails and slacks, but know that those are not the things that are adding value to your life. Right? The time that you spend thinking, the time that you spend creating value is what's going to move you forward, is going to move your career forward. So remember that when you accept a meeting.